Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is Jamie Bigger, and I am the campaign director and co founder of leadnow.ca. I want to just start by saying that I am really happy to be talking with you today. I have a great deal of respect for Lush, the work that you are doing, whether it's going to your website and seeing the feature on Refugees Welcome, or seeing the incredible amount of money that the charitable giving program has generated for so many different organizations, including, just to give a shout out to a local organization in Vancouver that I really love and admire and respect. Check Your Head. It's just great to see the range of different things that Lush is doing, and the ways in which you're translating your business into social change, both through the business itself and through the campaigns and the giving that you do. So, um, I'm very happy to be talking with you. I'm also sad that I can't be present with you. Unfortunately, I had a last minute, unexpected medical issue come up, and I am going to be at an appointment with my wife during the time when this presentation is going to be taking place. So I taught myself how to record a presentation over a slideshow and upload it to the internet. And I am pretty sure that this is all going to work out, but it'll be a little bit more dry than I would have been hoping, because I won't be able to be there with you. So I'm sorry again for that, but I put in some extra effort to make it as a bit of a consolation, and I hope that you find this presentation useful. So the topic of the presentation is looking at how laws are passed, developed and passed in Canada and in the United States. A little bit more, much more briefly, about the process in the United States. I'm a Canadian. I have a deep interest in American politics, but I'm a practitioner of Canadian politics. I know a lot more about it. And so I'm going to focus on the Canadian context. I'm then going to talk about the American context and do a little bit of compare and contrast. But then the main thing that I'm going to offer after that is go a bit beyond kind of the civics lesson about how this stuff works, especially how it works ideally, to talk about how to, not just how laws are made, but how to change laws from a campaigning perspective. So that's my main area of expertise, is campaigning, and I'll talk about campaigning in relation to changing laws, and I think that'll help to deepen the learning and the understanding of the process of making laws in the first place. So, what you'll learn, first, you'll learn about making a law in Canada. Second, you'll learn about making a law in America, but that's going to be a bit briefer. That's going to be focused on contrasting to the Canadian system. And then we'll talk about changing laws through campaigns. Okay, so who am I? As I was saying, my name is Jamie Bigger. I started out basically as an environmentalist. That was my first passion issue. I came at it from an academic place. Um, I When I was in my undergrad, I became very interested, actually first in the Iraq War, and I was opposed to the Iraq War. That was kind of the start of my political awakening, I think you could say. And I got really interested in, through the Iraq War, in the international politics of oil, the political economy of oil, the power and money around it. That led me to become interested in climate change and the power, money, and ecological impacts, and how all that's knit together around climate change led me to study something called political ecology, which is what my master's degree is in, which is looks at how those three systems really work together, how our politics, our economics, and our ecology, which ultimately provides the context and the home for all that economic and political life, how those three things work together. And initially, this is a very kind of academic pursuit, but I started to get more and more involved in activism. And the real start for that was when I was doing my graduate degree. at the University of Victoria, I had a professor named Michael McGonigal who was very involved in the question of in campus politics and in trying to make campuses real engines for positive social change, and in particular around climate, in making them, and climate and sustainability, and making them leaders in sustainability, in integrating all of their different assets, whether it's their education, their research, the power of their operations and buildings to be a showcase, or their acquisition of food to change the supply chain. All of those different pieces were really important for my thesis supervisor, and through him I became involved in campus activism, and through that became involved in um, the youth climate movement in Canada. This is in the mid 2000s. I also, at around the same time, developed a real interest in American politics. And, American politics, I found American politics very exciting. I had been turned on to it by the all the dynamics around the Iraq War, and I stayed paying attention to it for several years, and then I was really engaged in it um, during President Obama's first campaign for election in 2008, and his message really resonated with me. The message that they were going to work to bring people together across political lines for transformative social change, including taking on climate change. And that message really resonated with me. And I spent a lot of time reading up on the new campaigning and organizing techniques that campaign used. So they really pioneered the use of the internet in campaigns to fundraise, and also to recruit and organize just an army of like a massive army of volunteers who went out and knocked on doors and persuaded people to vote for Obama and got out the vote for him. And that work was in many ways inspired by a nonprofit organization in the United States called MoveOn.org. And MoveOn is a progressive campaigning organizations, primarily online, that really pioneered using online petitions to build an email list, to both to create change and to build an email list, and to keep then asking the people on that email list to join new campaigns, sign new petitions, but also move up what was called a ladder of engagement. So you start off by signing a petition, and then maybe you write a letter. You get asked to write a letter to the editor, and then perhaps you get asked to join a rally, and then perhaps you get asked to host a house party where you're going to be making phone calls to a local senator. And in each one of these stages, you are moving up this ladder of engagement, doing harder and harder things with support from the central organization. So that was MoveOn's model, and it was part of the DNA that then went into Obama's campaign model in 2008. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but MoveOn was the inspiration for a whole range of different organizations around the world. Get Up in Australia, 38 Degrees in the UK, an organization called Campact in Germany that used this model of primarily email-based online campaigning, using petitions and then moving people up a ladder of engagement. So you're moving people from online to offline to make as big a difference as possible at each one of those steps. And Lead Now, the organization that I then co-founded, was really based on trying to bring that model of campaigning and organizing to Canada, and then trying to root it in the Canadian political context. So right after Obama's election in 2008, in that same fall, um, Canada had its own election, and as I said before, my primary interest was always in climate change, and I had been focused down at the local level on campuses. I'd become more interested in and at that time, at the provincial level in British Columbia, there was a lot of leadership from our government, but it really seemed like this good stuff that was happening at the local level and at the provincial level was being counteracted or might be undone by the lack of leadership from our federal government, and who were, if anything, actively moving us in the wrong direction. And in 2008, we had an election where a strong majority of Canadians, so over 62% of Canadians, voted for over 62% of the people, the Canadians who voted, which is an important distinction, voted for parties that were promising strong climate action. However, because of our electoral system, which is called the first past the post electoral system, when you have more than two candidates in a riding in a local in one of these local elections, um, if say two of the three candidates want strong climate action and one of them does not, and those two candidates who want strong climate action split the vote, they both get 30%, and the one who doesn't gets 40%. So 60% of people voted for candidates who wanted strong climate action. 40% of people voted for candidates who didn't. So a strong majority of the people in that riding wanted strong climate action. But because of our first past the post electoral system, the person that gets 40% wins the seat. And when you add that up, all the different local riding level elections, when you add that up, you then get a situation where in 2008, 62% of voters backed parties calling for strong climate action. But because of our first past the post electoral system, the Conservatives who were opposing strong climate action won a minority government. I thought that that was outrageous, actually. I thought that that was, I didn't understand before then how our electoral system worked. That was the first time I really became aware of that in a deep way, and experienced it. And so I started an organization at the time. It was just a campaign, really, a small campaign called Canadians for Progressive Coalition, calling for the parties who wanted strong climate action and who had a majority of seats in the House of Parliament for them to work together to form a government, which they can do in our system without going back to another election, and then implement strong climate action as well as other policies that were supported by a majority of Canadians. Now, the story about what happens next is a little bit long, so I'm going to cut it short for now to get on to some of the other pieces, and we'll actually touch on that story a little bit later in this presentation. Long story short, we did not get a coalition, and I realized in that in the kind of fight that ensued around that, when the NDP and the Liberals and kind of unfortunately for the public relations around this, also the Bloc Québécois, came together to propose a coalition to defeat the Conservatives in an effort that ultimately didn't work out for them. I really saw the importance of and watching that issue then be defeated by a very successful campaign by the Conservatives to fearmonger about it, and they responded on a dime when it became a real threat. I saw that happen and realized that there was a need in Canada for an organization like MoveOn.org that could respond quickly in those moments, and would be able to be successful then in helping to both push back um, on more kind of anti-progress agendas, and also be able to organize people and be able to build more and more people power over time to make a real difference on deep issues like climate change. So it was through that campaign, through my experience in paying attention to American politics and learning about MoveOn.org and the influence that it had had in providing a model that was then adopted by other countries around the world, and in my experience of seeing how our broken electoral system could enable a government with really a minority of support to have power and move the country in a direction that was against the wishes of a majority of people in that country. And in the process of running that campaign, I had an online petition that built up an email list, and that became the foundation for Lead Now. So Lead Now is a community. Lead Now is now, we launched just before the 2011 federal election. We're now a community of almost 500,000 Canadians who work together on a range of different issues. So we brought these people together to identify through, house gatherings and online surveys, the key issue areas that they wanted to work in. The three big ones that came up for us were a strong democracy, a fair economy, and a clean environment as the three pillars of our work. And because the Harper Conservatives, when once again in 2011, the first past the post system meant that a majority of Canadians voted for change in that election, but the Conservatives actually got a majority government, even more power, despite the fact that 60% of voters wanted somebody else in a different direction. Um, so we saw that they were moving the country in the wrong direction on the different core areas that the community prioritized and focused over the last 4 years, really before the 2015 election, on holding that government accountable through our campaigns, trying to stop some of the worst of its abuses from our perspective, and also then organizing an electoral campaign where we brought people together across party lines to support progress on these issues, and to elect a candidate that could defeat the local conservative. So we were quite successful in that campaign. It was called Vote Together. And now that that is done, we were really focusing more on the positive aspect of the mandate of pushing for lasting change with this new government, with the Trudeau Liberals, who've made quite a lot of promises that we are now looking to support and push them on, to get as much positive change as possible, including a change to our voting system so that every vote would count. And it's a system generally called proportional representation. There's different kinds of it, but a system where every vote would count, and we would never again be in a situation where a party could win a minority of the votes but get a total majority of power. So in that kind of a system, if you get 10% of the vote, you get 10% of the seats, and then the parties figure out how to work together to represent a majority of Canadians. Okay, let's move on to talking more about the Canadian system. I've touched a little bit on the electoral system, but now let's talk about the broader political system in Canada. So Canada is a federal political system. It is a system where the provinces are actually quite powerful. So compared to most other countries around the world, so Canada's provinces have jurisdiction over very important portfolios that really directly impact the lives of a lot of people. So education, health, and energy are three of the big ones. The federal government, in turn, has jurisdiction over a range of issues, many of which are a bit less present in people's day-to-day. So things like the justice system, trade agreements, national defense are areas that are clearly underneath the jurisdiction of the federal government in Canada. However, at the same time, the federal government in Canada has extended its power into areas normally associated with provincial jurisdiction, largely through the use of the federal government's power to tax. So it raises revenue, which is then distributes around the country, in part to for equalization purposes, so to narrow the gap between the have provinces and the have not provinces, and the haves and the have nots within those provinces. And that's often done through spending that's focused on particular program areas like health. So the federal government maintains Canada's universal healthcare system by putting money, giving money to the provinces that it raises in taxes, and then attaching various conditions to that money. so that the province has to keep their system in line with those federal standards or they won't get the money anymore. Now, federal cutbacks have weakened their influence over the last, decade, 2 decades, but that is basically how the Canadian, that kind of balance of power now works. The provinces have direct jurisdiction for many of the most important things, but the federal government uses their power of taxation and convening and standard setting to get involved in those areas and to try to create a bit more of an even playing field across the country. So we have a parliamentary system, and the core of what that means is that the leader of the executive branch, in our case the prime minister, is elected and sits within the legislative branch of government. And so this is different than the American system, as we'll see in a second. In the American system, the president is elected in their own election and is separate from the legislative branch, the Congress in the United States, sits outside of it and has different powers and responsibilities. So in Canada, in order to be the prime minister, in order to be in charge, effectively in charge of the government, you need to have what's called the confidence of a majority of the MPs in Parliament. And what that means in practice is there's three ways that you could get that, the confidence of a majority of MPs in Parliament. One is if you just have a majority of government, so your government commands, your party commands a majority of the seats in Parliament, and you can expect them to vote with you on major issues. Then you will be able to you will almost certainly be able to maintain their confidence and be the prime minister and the governor general, who is the symbolic head of the representative of the Queen in Canada and the symbolic head of Canadian government, will accept that you should be the prime minister because you have a majority government. Another way that you can do it is if you have a minority government, but you clearly have, which means that you likely have the most seats of any party, and you go to the governor general and you say, I am going to form government with my this I have the most seats in Parliament, so I am going to form government, and you then have to maintain the confidence of a majority of parliamentarians by being able to pass, in particular, by being able to pass budgets. So budgets are what's called a confidence motion. If you can't pass a budget with a majority of MPs, then you lose the confidence of the House, and the Governor General will call a new election. In most circumstances, they'll call a new election. There's a third category then here, which is a coalition government, and this is where things get a little bit more complicated. Although coalition governments are fairly rare in Canada, they're the norm in almost the entirety of the rest of the kind of Western democratic world. And in particular, that's because of the fact that we have this kind of old school and now very rare first past the post voting system, whereas almost everybody else has some form of proportional representation, which tends to lead to more parties and a need to form coalitions in order to represent majorities. So the way a coalition government works is, say, two parties have, between them have, say one party has 100 seats and two other parties have 80 seats each for 160 total. The two parties that have 80 seats each make a deal with one another about how they will govern jointly. A representative from one of the two parties, and they negotiate this, will be the prime minister, and they will cooperate in government to put forward a common agenda and pass confidence motions. And can go to the governor general and say, we can form a government on the strength of this agreement, and then form that coalition government and be able to pass budgets and other issues through confidence votes. So this is just a quick review then of Canada's voting system and the kinds of distortions it creates. This is from the most recent election, the 2015 election, and there was a bit of irony which was that in 2011, 39% of Canadians voted for the Conservatives, which gave them a majority of seats in Parliament, and great power in Parliament, because and in government, because our executive branch, the Prime Minister, and our legislative branch, the House of Parliament, are connected. There aren't two separate branches, but they're integrated in one. If you control a majority of seats in Parliament, you have a lot of power to advance your agenda. But as you can see here, it's a bit skewed. So um, now, in the past, the Conservatives had a majority with a minority of support. Now the Liberals have a majority with a minority of support. And in a more proportional system, the number of seats would have reflected the popular vote, and then the parties would need to negotiate how they were going to work together to pass an agenda that could represent a majority. So let's talk quickly about the Senate. The Senate is the other part of the legislative branch of government in Canada. There is the House of Commons, where our MPs sit, and then they are elected, and then there's the Senate. The Senate is unelected, and it's traditionally filled with. This is not a very nice term, but it gives you a good sense. It's traditionally filled with what are called party bagmen, which just basically means fundraisers and organizers. So it has been an appointment to the Senate, historically has been a reward for party loyalty, and for doing good work for the party that appointed you. And that is part of the reason why the Senate no longer has a particularly good reputation in Canada. It's also had a traditionally quite limited role, which reflects the fact that it's unelected. So it has been supposed to provide sober second thought, which can mean catching problems, like legal problems from an implementation perspective, like this law, the way it is written, is very unclear, catching that kind of thing and bringing it back to the attention for changes by the House of Commons. And they have also explored through commissions and studies, it's been a place for exploring and researching really sticky, tricky public policy issues. So that has been the other role that the Senate's provided and senators provided that's been valued, is doing that kind of work. Now, in this moment in Canadian history, the future of the Senate is quite uncertain. It has become a very unpopular institution. There are a range of proposals on the table, from the Conservatives, who are proposing that the senators be elected, to the NDP, who would like to see the Senate abolished, to the Liberals, who are currently in the process of trying to create a more arm's length, merit-based system for appointing senators, so that senators would no longer be party bagmen, party fundraisers, and organizers, but would instead be people of some accomplishment in society. It'll be really interesting to see how that goes. The other reason that the future of the Senate is uncertain is that it is unclear how they will use their power going forward. So at the moment, the Conservatives actually control the Senate because of their appointments, and it's possible that they will start to exercise the power that they have to block bills that they disagree with. The Liberals did some of that when the Conservatives were in power. They really slowed down the Conservatives' crime bills. And the Senate has also actually killed, in the past, a climate bill that I was involved in trying to pass, which was a very frustrating experience. That a climate bill that had actually passed the House while the Conservatives had a minority in the House, only to be defeated in the Senate. So it is unclear both how the Trudeau Liberals' merit-based reforms are going to play out, and also whether or not the Senate, as it currently stands, may begin to play a more directly oppositional role to this government, which is something that they've done a little bit of, and the Liberals actually did create some precedent for, but at the same time is um, quite outside of the normal tradition of the Canadian Senate, especially since it is not actually an elected body and doesn't have that kind of democratic legitimacy. The other key player in Canadian lawmaking is the Governor General. The Governor General is generally basically a stamp of approval. The Governor General is the representative of the Queen, almost always simply assents to or agrees to a law once it reaches their desk. Um, and there are only a few occasions when the Governor General will actually make a more significant decision. And I was mentioning that the coalition fight earlier. That was one time in the recent past when a Governor General has made a very important and fateful decision. So what happened back in 2008 was the Conservatives put forward a budget bill. This is when they had a minority government. They put forward a budget bill that in the lead up to the 2008 economic crisis, sorry, we were in the midst of the 2008 economic crisis. This was right after the election. So this was in late October, November. It would have been in I think, mid-November 2008, when the economic crisis the financial collapse was in full swing. And they put forward a budget proposal, which, as I was saying earlier, that's a confidence vote. If the government loses a budget proposal, then they are no longer able to be government, and the Governor General will either see if there is another group that can command the confidence of a majority of MPs in the House, or if there should just simply be a new election. So the Conservatives put forward a budget that both contained no stimulus or action on the economic crisis, and it also contained an end to the per vote subsidy, which was basically public financing for our elections. So political parties got $1 for every vote they received, which is a way of keeping the influence of private money on elections low, and was a setup or a policy that benefited the other parties actually more than benefited the Conservatives because their fundraising was very strong. So the Conservatives put forward a budget bill in late 2008 that had no stimulus and had an end to the per vote subsidy, which would benefit the Conservatives over those other parties. And they really shocked the Conservatives by then coming together and saying, okay, no, actually, instead of passing this budget bill, we're going to form a coalition. We're going to defeat your budget bill, which will be a vote of no confidence in your government, and we're going to form a coalition government to replace you. Now, what happened next was a week-long war for public opinion, and the NDP and Liberal-led coalition, which also required some votes from the Bloc Québécois to have a majority, was defeated in that war for public opinion, significantly because of the presence of the Bloc Québécois. So the Conservatives argued that this was going to be a socialist separatist coalition, that separatists would have would have power over the new government, and that was intolerable, and they presented it as a coup, even though this is exactly how our government is supposed to work, in terms of people being able to pass a no confidence motion and then form a coalition government if they have a majority of seats to do it. So the Conservatives really won public opinion in that week, and then Prime Minister Harper went to then Governor General Michelle Jean, asked her to prorogue Parliament, which basically means suspending its operation, and did that to buy time. So avoided the no confidence vote by shutting down Parliament. And during the time when it was shut down, there was a change of leadership within the Liberal Party. So Stéphane Dion, who had been a champion for the coalition, was pushed aside, and Bob Rae, who was also a champion for the coalition and was advocating, was a leadership contender to replace Stéphane Dion. He was also lost this internal struggle, and Michael Ignatieff, who was opposed to the coalition, won it, and then rescinded the coalition proposal. So once that had happened, that was the end of that. Harper was able to stay in power, and so a very fateful decision by Michelle Jean. If she hadn't prorogued Parliament at Harper's request, it's possible that we would not have had more years of his government, or at least not in the same way that we might have had a coalition government. I'm just going to take 1 second to drink a little bit of water. You guys can hear my voice getting hoarse. I'm just going to drink some water and get back to it. Whew. Okay, so that's a lot of information. I know it's been kind of coming fast and furious in the last few minutes. So I'm going to try to really walk us through this next piece as we look at how a bill becomes a law and the key stages for it to become a law as it moves through the House of Commons into the Senate and then finally to the Governor General for royal assent. So here are the key steps. As you can see, I'm just going to read out the top lines quickly. Introduction and first reading, second reading, committee stage, report stage, third reading. So this will first happen in the House of Commons. There is relatively little action in the first two steps, introduction and first reading and second reading. Those are opportunities for those are opportunities, especially at second reading, for there to be a debate on the bill and a vote. Those will often be covered. There'll often be a lot of coverage over the debate that happens at second reading. So there will be a chance for the public to start to become more aware of what's going on generally around second reading as the opposition parties start to look for flaws in the legislation and see different ways that it could be improved or reasons that it should be scrapped altogether. After second reading, once some of those flaws have been exposed, it'll go to the committee stage. So a parliamentary committee, and there are many different parliamentary committees with different specific tasks. For example, right now there's a parliamentary committee focused on reviewing different options for electoral reform in Canada. That is one committee that we're watching very closely and engaging Canadians in connecting with that committee. At the committee stage, the committee will often, they'll review the law, the bill as it's being proposed. They will also often seek out expert testimony and try to get a sense of broader public opinion and desires through there's a range of different kind of consultation methods that they can do for that, town halls, online surveys, all those kinds of things. And they will really go through the bill clause by clause. So they'll give it a very close reading, and the committee itself will contain members of government and also members of parliament who are part of the government, and also opposition members in rough proportion to their the relative numbers of seats of those parties in parliament as a whole, and they'll debate it. At the report stage, all of that committee work is designed to create a report, which will include amendments to the bill, different fixes for different problems that have been exposed. This period here between the committee stage and the report stage was a key period for intervention in Lead Now campaigns in the Harper years. So one of the way that our campaigns would tend to roll out was at introduction and first reading. We would first launch the campaign to say, this is a bill that we're really concerned about. So, for example, there was a bill called misleadingly called the Fair Elections Act that did a few good things to give credit, but also was going to make it harder for people to vote. So we really raised the alarm about that during introduction and first reading, and then began that online campaign At second reading, that was another moment for us to, there was more media attention around this issue. Again, that was another moment for us to gain a lot more signatures on the petition and also ask people to write letters to the editor and to contact their MPs to start trying to really rally the public around this issue. And then once it went to the committee stage, we were focused on building as much pressure on that committee and on the government as possible in order to get amendments into the bill to take out some of the worst aspects of the bill when it went to the report stage, which we were successful in shifting up some of the worst, absolutely worst parts of the Fair Elections Act. Although there were still quite a few parts of that bill that were really not great, and which we're still looking to the new government to undo. But so at the report stage, there'll be changes incorporated into the bill. It'll then go to third reading. This is a debate and a vote on the amended version of the bill in the House of Commons. The debate will often be pretty fierce at this stage before it goes to a vote. And if a majority of MPs in the House of Commons vote for it again at third reading, the bill then goes to the Senate, where it will go through the exact same process. Now, that process will often be quite a bit faster, in part because it is so incredibly rare for the Senate to actually stop something that has been passed by the House of Commons, especially to stop it completely. But there will often be some suggested amendments that come out of the report stage, and then there is a process by which the changed bill from the Senate is then approved again by the House of Commons before it is ready. The two chambers of our Parliament are then in consensus about the bill, and it then goes to royal assent, which is when the Governor General essentially signs off on it as the representative of the Queen, and the bill becomes the law of the land. So that is how a bill becomes a law in Canada. Those are the key steps. And let's talk a little bit more about some of the different players and their role in this. So another really the most powerful people in shaping which laws go through this process and what the laws look like as they do it is the Prime Minister and their cabinet. This is a little bit of a joke, maybe not super funny, given the time at night in which I am putting this together. But just a bit of a joke about kind of two different conceptions of the relationship between the Prime Minister and their cabinet. So on the right, you have a picture of the current cabinet, which, to its credit, is the most, has been really lauded for its gender parity, the most diverse cabinet in Canadian history. You can see that the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is on the front row to the side a little bit, but really this is an image that speaks to the idea of the Prime Minister as being first amongst equals, which is much of the original conception of the role. It never quite played out like that, but the Prime Minister used to play more of a role of facilitator and spokesperson for cabinet than they do now. Now, the Prime Minister's office, the PMO, so the Prime Minister and their office, that office has really grown. Under the Harper Conservatives, I think it came to employ 2,500 staff. And the Trudeau, the Prime Minister's office is again very powerful. Key staffers in the PMO have an enormous influence over the Liberal Party and therefore their majority. So there's been a shift towards this kind of more Zeus-like, one powerful figure who is able to really shape and move the agenda of government. This shift from the kind of idea of first amongst equals to a more powerful individual centralized role for the Prime Minister and their office. The cabinet ministers, in turn, though, are responsible for whole departments, so Department of Defense, Environment, that kind of thing. There was a cabinet minister, is this politician who is elected and then appointed to that role by the prime minister, and then they have a deputy minister who is a civil servant who is basically the chief executive of that department, who reports to the cabinet minister. And The relative power of the cabinet minister and the PMO can often be difficult to tell from the outside. So, the degree to which the cabinet minister is the most important decision maker, or policy and political staff within the PMO are the most important decision maker, can be kind of hard to tell without a bit more case by case evidence. Some cabinet ministers are much stronger than others, while others have their portfolios largely managed out of the PMO. There is another group then. So there's the prime minister and their cabinet. Their cabinet tends to be selected because they are competent and will do a good job of running departments and persuading the public that they are doing a good job of running those departments. And then there are all of the other MPs in the governing party, and they are called backbench MPs. So these are people who are outside of cabinet, and they have three main jobs. One of those jobs is not much fun. It is to largely rubber stamp the decisions being made by the Prime Minister's office and cabinet, and to vote in favor of whatever the government is proposing. Their second job, which is more interesting and gives them more freedom to contribute, is they will serve on committees, those committees that review bills and make amendments to them. So that is a space for them to do good work and potentially through good committee work to be eventually promoted into cabinet. And then the third way in which they can earn a place in cabinet, and the most third important duty for backbench MPs, is they're perpetually campaigning in their ridings, in their constituencies, to constantly be listening to how people are reacting to the government's policies, and also to be acting as persuaders, who are both not only listening to how the public's reacting, but also persuading their constituents to be in support of the government's actions. They're getting on the radio, they're doing all of that kind of work to go out in the perpetual campaign for the policies and the power of their government. There is then all of the other MPs who are not in the governing party form the loyal opposition. Loyal in the sense that it is loyal to the country, but opposition in that they are also duty bound to oppose the government's agenda so that it can be examined and improved. The idea here is very similar to our court system, where in our court system you have the prosecution and the defense. They are not cooperating with one another to try to come to the truth. They are competing with one another to try to expose the truth with competing visions of what the truth is. And the idea is that through that competition, the judge and the jury will be able to get the best sense of what has really happened. So the prosecution will make a case, the defense will try to defeat that case, and as the defense and the prosecution really test each other, the judge and the jury will be able to discern the truth of the matter. Similar idea with the role of the opposition parties in Canada and in other parliamentary systems to routinely oppose the measures put forward by government. Now, there's shifts in this when the government doesn't have a majority and actually does need the opposition parties, doesn't have a majority and isn't in a coalition, and actually does need the opposition parties to vote with them. What will often happen in that case is that the opposition parties will oppose significant portions of the bill and try to get them changed, but ultimately vote for the bill even while registering some concerns with it, especially if they don't want to have to go to an election. So, so they will oppose it, but also ultimately support it. So this ad I've got here is just an example of the kind of thing that the kind of thing you do as the opposition. So this is pushing back on conservative changes to gun laws by trying to make the case that they are a bad idea, with the idea that this big public kind of competition over idea about ideas will lead to ultimately the best decisions being made. So there are two kind of different major categories of bills that are put forward in Parliament. One is government bills, which I have represented with this high-speed train, which is probably not a totally fair way of representing it, because the process can still really take some time. In my experience, it can easily take as long as a year or longer for a bill to work its way through Parliament. But government bills, especially when that government has a majority, the government is able to has significant control over the agenda of Parliament. And so they are able to control the timing with which that bill will go to first reading and second reading, go to committee, move through those different stages. And that allows them that and their ability to actually pass the bill without requiring any votes from anybody else means that they can move things through quite quickly. The government bills are almost always come out of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, that core nexus of power in the party, and are then supported by all of the other MPs, all the other government MPs, the backbench MPs. And they tend to represent a fairly coherent agenda on the government's part. So the different aspects of that agenda, as they try to deliver on their promises, well, we'll get into what they're trying to do more in that third section on campaigning to change laws. But these government bills tend to come from the top down, and to be part of this coherent agenda, and to move relatively quickly and with relative certainty that they will be passed, even if amended. There is another kind of whole category of bills, which are private member bills. Private member bills are put forward by, just as the title says, private members, either from the governing party or opposition members. And a private member bill goes through the same process largely as a government bill, first reading, second reading, third reading, all that. But the private member has much less power to control the timing of that, or to ensure that it actually passes first reading or second reading, and ever goes to the committee stage. So most private members' bills will die, especially in second reading. They won't be able to pass a vote. And that'll be the end of that. But sometimes private members' bills will go through. One very prominent example that we campaigned for extensively was the Reform Act. This was a bill championed by Michael Chong, who was a Conservative MP, and the Reform Act was designed to reduce the power of the Prime Minister within their party, so reduce that centralization of power that I was talking about earlier. And it started as a private member bill, and managed to gain support from enough people across the parties to actually pass. And narrowly, the Senate really dragged their feet on this, but narrowly became law before the end of the last election. So that was really great to see from our perspective. We both had the ability to limit some of the worst damage that government was doing, and we also had the ability to pass a democratic reform underneath that government's majority, which was two things that we really didn't know if we would be able to make that kind of change back in 2011 when that government first got its majority. Okay, so let's talk a bit more about the American system of government now, in contrast. So the American system is uh, really organized around the idea of checks and balances. So in the Canadian system, the the prime minister is in parliament. That executive function of the prime minister and cabinet who actually run the government is embedded within the legislative branch, which passes the laws. Those two functions of being the executive and being in charge of legislation are unified and held within the same people, the same body. In the United States, they're split out. So there's the executive branch, which is the president, who is elected separately from the legislative branch and Congress. And then there's the judicial branch, which is also important in Canada, but I haven't talked about very much. I'm not going to talk about very much in this presentation. It's just a little bit outside of the scope. But so in the American system, the executive branch and the legislative branch have different powers, and the existence and the split between them means that they're both less powerful than they would be in a system where the executive branch and the legislative branch were integrated together. So the American Congress is similar to the Canadian Parliament in that it has two different chambers. So there is the House of Representatives and the Senate. In the United States, the Senate is elected, though, a huge difference, and often wields quite a bit of power. So, how does a bill become law in the United States? Well, it goes through this cycle. So, the bill is first introduced, can be introduced in either the Senate or in the House of Representatives. It'll then go to congressional committees, similar to the committee stage in the Canadian system, in those committees, it will receive different amendments, different reports. They'll do that they'll call expert witnesses. They'll do all of that, and then it will be passed through the committee to what's called the floor of the House or the floor of the Senate for a vote by that whole body. Both the House and the Senate will need to vote to approve a bill, at which point it will go to, and I know this is a bit hard to read, step 5 here, which is conference, conference is the stage at which the House bill and the Senate bill are reconciled. So if there's any differences between the two bills, there's a negotiation at this stage about how to reconcile them into one law. And once that's done, it then goes to the president. Instead of, in the Canadian system, it would go to the Governor General, who would be expected to pass it. In the United States, it goes to the president, who then has a choice about whether they're going to sign it into law or they're going to veto, and they'll actually exercise that choice. So it is an important step. What this means is that the House, a majority in the House, a majority, and often a supermajority, 60% or more to avoid a filibuster, in the Senate and the president all have to agree to a law for it to become a law. So there's a much more consensus building required to pass a law in the United States than there is in Canada, where in Canada, really, convention means that the prime minister and a very small circle are all the people that would need to agree that the law should be passed for it to be passed if they have a majority government. So core responsibilities of Congress then are to draft and amend bills. In the House of Representatives is a much larger body. There's 435 of them. It changes based on changes in population. At the moment, the Republicans have a majority with 247 seats. They have elections every 2 years. Very, very frequent elections. I am sure that is not very much fun for them because it means, you've barely caught your breath from one election when you need to start fundraising for the next. In the Senate, there is 100 of them, about 2 per state. Again, the Republicans have a majority of Senate seats with 54 seats, and they have elections every 6 years, so they have a lot more time between elections. But those elections are staggered, so at any given time, a third every 2 years, a third of the Senate, the entire House of Representatives, will go to election, and a third of the senators will go to re-election every 2 years. So the president then governs. The president is responsible for appointing their own cabinet, who are not necessarily people from the House of Representatives or Senate in general. Generally aren't people from the legislative branch. They appoint their cabinet, who runs the departments of government, and the president has the power to either sign and approve a law or to veto that law. And the threat of a veto is one of the main ways in which the president can then really negotiate, press their ability to negotiate with Congress to come to something that they can all largely agree to. The president has an election. The presidential elections happen every 4 years, and they have a two-term limit, which is the reason that Barack Obama is not up for re-election right now. So let's talk about some of the really major differences between these systems. In the American system, they have a much weaker executive branch. These branches of government, they really need to work together more, or really nothing will happen. And we've actually seen this in the Obama presidency. So normally there would have been an expectation that the different bodies of government, Congress, the House, the Senate, and the presidency, excuse me, excuse me, there would have been a real expectation that those different bodies of government would have worked together to pass laws. In the 1990s, there was a real expectation that the Republican House under Newt Gingrich and the Democratic White House, led by Bill Clinton, they found a variety of areas where they had mutual agreement to move things forward, and in some areas where they really didn't, there became a huge and very politically potent battle when the Republicans threatened to really shut down government over some budget bills. Now, in the United States under Obama, the Republicans have shifted this in Congress, once they won control of Congress by really opposing just about everything that the president has put forward. In turn, the president's done a lot of vetoing of things that they've put forward. And the political calculus there was that, and it's hard to remember this now, but back in 2008, Obama was polling very well with independents, so people who might vote Democrat, might vote Republican, and moderate Republicans. And the Republicans worried that if they worked together, if they collaborated with Obama, they would give him credibility as a moderate and as a centrist, and then help him in many ways to become more popular with independents and moderate Republicans that the Republicans need to win elections. They responded to that threat to their own electoral coalition by really campaigning very hard to present Obama as being, very outside of the mainstream, very radical, and kind of almost anti-American. But the sheer ferocity of that opposition and stridentness of that opposition is actually unusual in the American context. It's not normally anything like that intense. Another really major difference in the American system is that there's much less party discipline. And what that means is that in Canada, there's an expectation of party discipline most of the time. So most of the time, the MPs are expected to vote with their party on whatever bill, and then they'll all vote together, which is why a majority government is so effective, is because there's an expectation that all of those MPs will vote together to pass laws together. In the United States, there's much less party discipline. There will often be some Democrat, like if it's a Democrat bill, most Democrats will probably vote for it, but there'll be many who don't. And there'll be some Republicans who vote for it and many who don't. It's much more kind of up to the uh, different politicians. So, for example, Obamacare. So I'm just gonna have a drink of water. Obamacare, which was really President Obama's, signature. It was called the Affordable Health Care Act, um, signature bill in 2009 in his first year of the presidency, when he had his biggest mandate for change. That bill um, narrowly passed the House of Representatives, even though there was a majority Democrats in it. 219 for, 212 against, with 34 Democrats voting against it and 174 Republicans also voting against it. And then some Republicans voted for it, although I don't have the number off the top of my head. There was also in this final bill, there was no what was called the public option. So without getting into the policy in too much detail, the public option would have been an option to have a government-owned insurance agency that you would have been able to buy insurance from, and the private insurance companies were very opposed to that idea for obvious reasons. They didn't want competition from presumably a more affordable government-run option to be part of the mix, because that would have made things a bit harder for them. So they strongly opposed it, and waged a quite powerful campaign to get Democrats and Republicans both to oppose the public option. And it ultimately became clear that even though President Obama was in favor of a public option, it became clear that they just weren't going to have the votes to pass a version of the bill that had a public option. So the final version that, as you can see, just squeaked through with 7 votes, had no public option. So one of the things you're probably gathering from this is that the individual representatives are much more powerful in the American system than they are in the Canadian system. So in the House, the process of creating amendments is one that can definitely improve bills. And this process of creating amendments is one of the major things that individual reps will do, is they'll propose amendments to bills and try to get them added in, especially at committee stage. So they can definitely make pills better, but they can also be used to put in poison pills. So you can amend. It's a tactic for trying to kill a bill, is that you add an amendment to it that makes it unpalatable to some of the people who were previously needed to pass it, and then the bill with the new poison pill fails. Or adding pork, which is local spending in the representative's district that has very little to do with the ultimate purpose of the bill. This is one of the reasons that it is so hard to reduce defense spending in the United States, is that whether by the design of the defense agencies or just through sheer pork belly politics, as it's called, the American defense contract, the bases and the defense contractors and suppliers, that whole infrastructure and all the jobs associated with it is spread throughout the United States. So if you were going to start cutting, you would immediately have very widespread opposition from politicians across the country who rely on that defense spending for local jobs. Whereas if you could imagine, if the entirety of the American military and then defense procurement system, if all of that was concentrated in, say, Florida, then the rest of the country could easily reduce the budget of it without feeling nearly the same kind of economic loss. In the Senate is different in that it operates people tend to be in the Senate for quite a bit longer than they are in the House of Representatives. They have a longer career spans in there, in part because of their longer terms. And as you gain seniority in the Senate, the longer you're there, the more rights you have to take more senior uh, positions on more important committees. And your power and influence over a committee, like a committee that governs energy usage in the United States, is then a very powerful tool for you, a very significant source of power, which will mean that all kinds of different groups and individuals will be trying to lobby you and curry your favor and offer you favors in exchange for you advancing their agenda through those committees. Okay, we are at an hour and 10 minutes in, and we are going to go for a chunk longer. We're now going to start to talk about changing laws through campaigns. So get ready for that. I just really want to encourage everybody to take a little bit of a mental break. Now, I can't be there with you. I know that I've probably, sending this recording to you, I know that I probably lost you guys a couple times. Hopefully, I've gotten you back a couple times over the course of the last hour or so. But what I'd really encourage you to do right now, if you can, is just get up and take a stretch. Take a couple big deep breaths. If you're really feeling into it, maybe sway your arms a little bit, just get the blood moving a little bit. And we will return to talking about changing laws through campaigns in 3, 2, 1. Okay. So let's talk about changing laws through campaigns. This is going to be another lens for looking at how laws are made. Another way of looking at that question that'll explore more of the dynamics around why governments will do the things that they do and how to have influence at the different stages of the process. This is a photo. Actually, I should have picked a more successful campaign. This was a campaign where we really rallied public opinion, but unfortunately did not actually change the government's decision. This is a rally opposing their omnibus budget bill back in 2012, which is where the government rammed a whole bunch of different unrelated changes all in one budget law. So in particular, they dismantled a whole bunch of Canada's environmental protections in this budget bill. And this was something that we were opposed to, our community was opposed to. This is one of the local rallies that we hosted to oppose it. And that woman on the left there who's speaking to the crowd is my sister, and I am her proud older brother. Okay. So one of the key things to understand is kind of the first step in governments beginning to roll out their proposed laws is that they are looking for support. So this is a picture of Canada's Prime Minister. I imagine he's quickly becoming one of the most photographed people in the world. I imagine most of you know who he is, even if you're not Canadian. This is a picture of him at a rally, and the Liberals are a really interesting example of the importance of a voting coalition. So a government they're always to a certain degree thinking about re-election, although to varying degrees, which is something we'll talk about in the next slide. But governments want to maintain and expand their voting coalition to try to secure their power and win re-election. And so a government a competent political party will understand their voting coalition. They'll understand the kinds of people who tend to vote for them and the kinds of people they need to vote for them, and the places where they need those kinds of people to vote for them in order to win. And so when they have mapped out their voting coalition, which could be something along the lines of, Well, I'll give you an example of the contrast. The Conservatives broke um, the Canadian population into, I think it was 35 different groups, and they called them, they were like archetypes. They were representative of, um, um, kind of broader demographics within Canadian society, and they were really disciplined about only paying attention to their own voting coalition within those archetypes. So they realized, they looked at the numbers and they realized that young women with college degrees in urban areas were incredibly unlikely to vote conservative. And as a result, and they named that archetype Zoe. And as a result, they really didn't care what Zoe's, people who fit that archetype, thought. Because the conservatives were convinced that those people just weren't in their voting coalition. They weren't potential conservative voters. So why would they waste their resources on trying to persuade those people to vote for them? So with key segments of the population then either included or excluded from the voting coalition, a government, when they're looking to pass laws, will look to excite their own voting coalition, the people who are already in that coalition, and win over new people, and avoid losing key people in that voting coalition to the opposition. So that'll be one of the key perspectives that they're taking to this question. They'll also look at the network of organizers, donors, and influencers that has helped to elect the party, and helps to shape public opinion in favor of that party. So that could be key leaders in different communities. It could be business leaders. It could be leaders in academia, and it can be, people with money and wealthy friends who can donate the maximum, and it can be people who have the time and the energy to get out and organize for the party, and help get them the votes they need to win. So the voting coalition is these kind of broader segments of the population, and then the network of organizers, donors, and influencers is people that the party and its leadership will have more direct relationships with. And the government will tend to be more sensitive to what those people think and want as they look to maintain and expand their support. Okay, so this is the life cycle of government legislation, or the process of creating legislation. Um, a government, a new government, after being elected, will come in with a mandate to make changes based on their election promises. And the strength of that mandate will vary. In Canada, the Trudeau Liberals received a very strong mandate. So they promised real change. A strong majority of people voted for them because they saw them as being the most likely to defeat Harper, and because of that promise for real change. So they have this strong, strong mandate. In the first year, the governments tend to really focus on starting to deliver on some of their promises, especially some of the easier ones for them to figure out how they're going to meet, and do a lot of listening on some of the harder ones, to try to figure out how they're going to keep that voting coalition together, and avoid potentially legal issues or other problems if they don't do a good job of designing the law. Right now, with the Trudeau Liberals, they're very focused on consultations on a wide range of issues, as their listening tool to try to figure out where the public is on a range of different things, and also to give themselves some more time to draft to come up with proposals, which will become legislation for electoral reform, for climate policy, and a range of different pieces. There's about to be a big review of their the very controversial spy agency bill, Bill C-51, that was passed a little bit over a year before the last election. In year two, the biggest, all the biggest promises that they intend to actually keep are now moving through legislation, and they will really try to get those changes through legislation by the end of the second year. If something doesn't happen by the end of the second year, there is a good chance it won't happen within this mandate, within this term of government. And the reason for that is that after that, the government becomes completely focused, almost completely focused on re-election. And they become much more conservative, not politically, but in the sense of much more risk averse, much more cautious about not wanting to rock the boat and make other changes that might generate more opposition to them closer to the election itself. Part of the calculation that they're making here is that people who are going to be unhappy with the changes that they made are going to have some time to kind of cool down and forget about it by the time of the election itself, and hopefully some of the benefits from those changes will have started to come in a way that will address people's concerns and help them to just move forward. So in year 3 and year 4, they are really shifting out of having focused on delivering on their promises in a way that'll maintain and expand their support to they go into a listening mode, a bit of a crisis management mode, and begin to really focus on the next election. And the key question now is around the nature of the party platform, the promises that they will make for the next election. So in year 1 and 2, if you want the government to make, if you are broadly supportive of the kinds of changes that the government could make, but want them to be want the government to really live up to its commitments and want them to make strong changes, then you need to be pushing the government as much as you can in year 1 and 2, which is when they'll actually make those changes. In year 3 and year 4, as a campaigner, the focus now is more on, if you're trying to push that government to be better, the focus now is more on trying to raise the bar for their platform that they'll go into the next election in. Now, on the other hand, if you are generally opposing the government, then you will be very busy in years 1 and 2 dealing with them trying to push their agenda through and opposing and working to oppose that. And then you yourself in year 3 will be likely focused on exposing some of the problems with the kinds of changes they've made as a way of continuing to grow opposition as you then become more focused on the election itself and potentially on trying to defeat that government. Okay. One of the really key principles for us at Lead Now, something we think about and talk about a lot, is the idea that in campaigns we need to unite us and divide them. And this is a quote, an idea that comes from a range of different areas. It's most often attributed to a really legendary American organizer named Saul Alinsky. So the basic idea behind unite us and divide them, it's something that governments do as well. They understand this principle. That's part of why what I was saying earlier about how they're trying to maintain their voting coalition and expand it is very similar to the idea of unite us and divide them. So to give really practical examples of what this means, broadly it means you want to unite your base of supporters and divide your opponent's supporters by recruiting some of those people to either support your proposal or at least to kind of sit the fight out. And you will tend to be successful when you unite your supporters and recruit and divide them by recruiting some of their supporters. That you will tend to be successful. And if you divide yourself and unite them, which you can do by having poorly researched, overly incendiary positions or communications, then you are almost always going to be in trouble. So, as I was saying before, with the Harper Conservatives, when we were campaigning, when they had a majority government, they really didn't care about what most progressive voters thought. And so when we were organizing progressive voters and getting those folks to sign petitions, that was important for a variety of reasons. It showed the progressive parties, the more progressive parties, that there was a lot of interest. It helped to strengthen their positions on different things. It also helped to generate more media interest, and raise the story of opposition to what they were doing into the public consciousness, in a way that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And it was really important for organizing, for starting to build this community that could work together at key moments. But it wasn't enough. If you were going to change the Harper conservatives' behavior, it wasn't enough to just organize progressives, because they really didn't care what progressives thought, because they didn't need the progressives to win. To shift the Harper conservatives, you needed to actually split their base and build unlikely alliances. And so the way that we did that, and I'll explain the photo in a second. The way we did that was we looked at the conservative voting coalition, and we looked at the kinds of things that their different groups in that voting coalition cared about, and the kinds of things that progressives cared about, and looked at, where are there areas where there's real overlap here, where there are parts of the conservative base that can really work together with progressives to oppose elements of this government's agenda. And the key ally for that was libertarians, who or very principled conservatives who were very resistant to greater government control and intrusion, surveillance, all those different kinds of things. So one of the major campaigns where we united progressives and divided conservatives by recruiting a lot of those libertarians was opposition to a really terrible, secretive and anti-democratic trade and investment agreement that was proposed with China, called the Canada-China FIPA. And it was a bill that was broadly opposed by progressives, also opposed by different groups within the conservative coalition, in particular libertarians, but also people who had been negatively affected by international trade and globalization, and were worried about what would happen if Canada-China FIPA went through. And that breadth of opposition really gave them concern. In addition to that, we had a relationship with a First Nation, the Hoopa-Chasseth. This is a photo of Brenda Sayers, who is a real leader with the Hoopa-Chasseth, who led them in opposing the Canada-China FIPA in court, arguing that it was going to trample over First Nations rights. So this is a really cool story. The upshot of it was that we ended up in a situation where we were asking conservative supporters, many of whom were, very concerned about the influence of China on Canada, to donate to pay for a First Nations legal challenge, because it was actually the First Nations First Nations broadly, and this First Nation in particular, that had, the treaties and rights to oppose this agreement that would have infringed upon their rights. So one of the best ways to actually stop the agreement was by supporting these legal challenges. So it was a really unlikely alliance that we were able to create that worked to split the conservative base and ultimately delayed the Canada-China FIPA for years, in one of the biggest campaigns we ran underneath the Harper conservatives. Okay, now building on that, a related concept is the idea of scripted versus unscripted opposition. So, I was Googling for images. I came across this one of Justice holding up the scales of justice. The idea here is that a politician, a government, when they announce a decision, they have already held up the scales and thought about the support and opposition to that decision, and how heavy that support and opposition is going to be, how big it's going to be. Excuse me for 1 second, I'm just going to cough. And if they've made the announcement, if they've gone and done that, it's because they have already anticipated that they'll be able to weather the opposition that they think is going to happen. So if the only if the only opposition that they then get is the opposition they expected, what you could call scripted or predicted opposition or support, then they're not going to change their mind because that's what they already thought was going to happen, and they already made their decision based on that expectation. What that means is that to actually shift a government, either to support bigger changes or to stop them from doing what they're trying to do, you need to either have more intensity in your opposition and support, so more people with more impactful tactics, or you need really unexpected allies. Either one of those two things, ideally both of them, can shift the calculus for that government, which is really, I think, what we did with the Canada-China FIPA. We put them back on their back heels on that one, and then it took them years before they felt comfortable trying to pass it again, as the kind of passage of time and the bill, no, and the agreement no longer being in the news meant that it was easier to get it through, as opposition at that point had died down. Okay, I am almost at the end here, which is good because we are almost at the end of our time, and I have thrown so much information at you guys. You have been an amazing group to listen to this. And I really appreciate that. So I've just got a couple more concepts to discuss and to share with you that I hope you find interesting. So, um, in thinking through these kind of sequences of government activity and this legislative cycle and different ways to influence the decisions and different things to think about, I want to take a step back to think bigger. So what does it take to make bigger changes that will not just shift kind of one government or another's behavior, but shift things for years, shift where all the parties are at, or shift the total, like the shift, take us from there not being very strong climate policy to being their strong climate policy that endures. And there's two key concepts here that I want to share that are really important for that. One is called the Overton's window, and the other is organizing. So Overton's window is an idea, is a concept, which is invented by a person named Overton, I believe, that the window is the range of the range of debate for positions on an issue that are thought to be within the mainstream and acceptable. So the range of debate could be, for example, the minimum wage should be $10 an hour, or the minimum wage should be $12 an hour. And if you have a position that's outside of those two poles, if everybody's just talking about $10 an hour or $12 an hour, you're going to sound crazy, and the public is unlikely to be ready for that kind of a change if it's outside of the parameters of accepted debate. So that's why campaigns like Fight for 15 and the living wage campaigns, which really try to open up space to talk about bigger increases to the minimum wage in order to allow people to live, really, with any kind of with any kind of significant dignity. Those campaigns are designed to expand the acceptable realm of debate, to shift Overton's window, so that all of a sudden you're not just talking about $10 or $12, you're talking about $15, and that starts off being a kind of radical position, but then becomes a more and more normal and accepted position, and then ultimately the mainstream position, as more and more people talk about it. Now, Overton's window is contested. There'll be different sides of that fight. Will be trying to pull it in different directions. One of the great examples of this is in the United States around reproductive rights. There's been a real battle between people who believe that women should have access to abortions, and people who have been trying to limit that and shut that down. A real struggle around the rhetoric and the language that's used with both sides trying to expand the realm of acceptable discussion in a way that favors them and shut it down in ways that don't favor them. So um, um, that work is very powerful because the governments ultimately need to believe that their policy positions won't lose them huge amounts of support. And if they believe that their opponents will be successful in moving the Overton's window against them, or that just the public's not quite there yet, then they're going to be way more hesitant to actually do the good thing. So, and you can so you can shift Overton's window in turn by staking out positions that expand it. And this is often the really positive role of more radical protesters, is that they can open up Overton's window. It's one of the really powerful things that the Occupy Wall Street protesters did, was they really changed the conversation and they shifted the Overton's window to focus on the problem of inequality, and that the proverbial 1% were making so much more money than everybody else. Um, okay, so organizing then is the practice of building political power by connecting and empowering people and structures that can mobilize to pressure decision makers. It's a bit of an academic way of describing it, a bit of a dry way of describing it, but the core of it is building people power, and building it in a way that it can be mobilized in key moments, and ideally in the most strategic, important places. So, with the conservatives, the key area to build in was in what we called the conservative swing ridings, which were places where the conservatives won with less than 50% of the vote, and if progressives got together, they could defeat them. That was the really important place for us to organize progressives. We needed to organize people in those areas if we wanted to have a chance of defeating that government. With the Trudeau Liberals, they won the election because a whole bunch of people got together, a whole bunch of people who normally vote NDP, normally vote Green, and many people who had never voted before but were really inspired to come out and vote for change, all voted. Many of those people came together and voted Liberal to defeat the Conservatives, and because of the Liberals' promises for real change. And so the Liberals know that they need those progressives to vote for them again in the next election for them to have a chance of winning. And that means that the most important places to organize now are no longer, aren't really those conservative swing ridings, but is actually places where, if you want to push this government for more progressive changes, you want to be organizing in places where, mainly in red-orange swing ridings, in places where the Liberals could lose some votes to the NDP, the votes that they really need to win another majority government, which they really want to do, unless they deliver on their progressive platform. So um, that's now the more important place to organize. So organizing is the other key way, building deep people power, building these constituencies to be able to shift politicians on issues, ideally in strategic locations, is one of the other main ways to make big changes. And we're almost done here. Last couple slides. So the last concept I just want to raise is the difference between soft power and hard power. So soft power is about having somebody want to do the thing you want them to do. So the more soft power you have, the more people want to do something because they think it's the right idea or they like you. And the more hard power you have, hard power is about getting somebody to do something because they're afraid of you. They're afraid that if they don't do what you want them to do, then you will um, make it so they don't get elected, or you will reduce the profits of their company by doing a markets campaign, or all those different things. So ideally, to successfully change laws, you want to have a combination of both soft power and hard power. Soft power, which really comes from relationship building and building credibility and support around the ideas you're advocating, and then shifting Overton's window so that the previously unthinkable idea becomes mainstream, the mainstream assumed right thing to do, and at the same time building hard power, generally by organizing, and having the ability, and by protesting, by having the ability to um, criticize them the government publicly effectively. They don't do what you want to do in a way that could shift public opinion against them. You really want a combination of those two things to be successful. So, bringing it back together, um, on the left we have um, a classic campaign arc. Just this is I know this stuff from Marshall Ganz's work on organizing, but it looks at the kind of different stages in organizing a campaign where you are trying to build people power, and organize people around the specific issue, and you can't just it can't just be all peak moments all the time. You have to keep building. And so you're building a foundation for a while, you kick off your campaign, then there's a lull when people aren't really paying as much attention, but you're working towards these different peaks. And the peaks are milestones, they're moments along the journey where you can organize people to take actions that'll be effective in those moments as you keep building then and growing towards the big moment when you're able to actually push to pass the law or to stop a bad project or whatever, before you then need to maintain some residual power after that big peak moment's done to ensure that the resolution goes in a way that you want it to go. And so, sorry, I'm just going to cough one more time. And so you can see here on the right, Parliament as a law moves through these different stages: second reading, the committee stage, the report stage, third reading off to the Senate. Those are different moments that we can campaign around and organize around to be those little peaks on the way to the big peak of third reading generally. Whether or not the government will ultimately pass it, these earlier moments give us what we call in the business inflection points, organizing opportunities, campaign moments, where we can bring people together and they can make a difference, and you can grow the campaign by doing that. Okay, with that, good luck. Thank you. I really appreciate your time and attention. Thank you for inviting me to this. I'm sorry again that I couldn't be there in person with you. If you have any questions or would like to reach out to me, you can get me at jamie.bigger@leadnow.ca. And once again, thank you very much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.